All right, hello. So in this video, we're going to continue talking about Bootstrap. And in particular, we're going to talk about how to use Bootstrap in a responsive manner. And which particularly means that it's going to work well on mobile devices, on when viewing a page on a phone, in addition to viewing it well, have it work well on like a laptop or a desktop. So what we're going to do in this video is we're talk briefly about what we mean by responsive design. Note that there will be a separate lecture, sort of a separate video about responsive design and how we actually implement that in the CSS. But we're going to sort of give you a preview of that so you sort of understand the context in which Bootstrap's working. We're then going to talk about a little bit about its responsive utilities and responsive classes that it provides. And then we'll go over a specific example using the grid system, which is sort of another set of responsive-ish kinds of structures that exist. Okay, so when we say responsive design, we say that a page is responsive. We don't mean that it like responds to the user inputting, or that it like is reactive, or that it sort of has a smooth kind of user interface. When we say that a page in web development, when we say that something is responsive, we mean that as a web page that's appearance will alter and change depending on what kind of device you're viewing the web page on. So the idea is that if you view a web page on a phone, it'll be styled to like look good on a small vertical screen. If you view that exact same web page on a laptop or a desktop, it'll be styled to look good on a large sort of horizontal-ish kinds of screen. The content will remain generally the same, right? It's the same HTML, it's the same page, but we can have our CSS, our appearance, our styling look different depending on what we're doing. In order to make all of our anything work responsively, there is one piece that we need to include in our HTML, which is what's called the viewport meta. So what we need to do is we need to be able to tell our browser that when things get smaller, the browser shouldn't try to shrink the text to fit, but instead should be able to follow sort of let our own code drive what's happening one way or the other. You can see this effect a little bit in the browser. So normally if I just resize the page, nothing really changes too much. If I open up my developer tools and I click on this second icon, the one that looks like a phone with a tablet next to it, I can open up what's called the responsive sort of design view, which is, oh my gosh, sorry, I need to make this a little bit smaller, which basically lets you be able to sort of see kind of what your page might look like on different devices of different widths. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about responsive things. So you'll notice what happens here is that when I try to shrink my page, if I say, let's view it on a smaller device, everything zooms out, right? It basically says, cool, we're just going to show the page on the desktop version. We're just going to like shrink it down so it gets really small, so we actually can't see what that looks like. You'll notice this if you go to a web page and you go to the desktop view from your phone, or if you go to some web pages where it's just like something that looks like the whole thing was zoomed out, that's because they haven't done this work. So what we're going to need to do in order to make our page responsive, even when using Bootstrap, is we need to make sure we've included what's called the viewport meta. So a meta element is similar to what we've used for author, it's similar to what we've used for character set, but in this case, we're specifying not the author, but the viewport. And our content is going to be this complex string of options, namely saying that we want the width of our page to be however big the device is. It should start at sort of 1-to-1, don't start zoomed in, and do not shrink to fit the page. There's some other things that can get included in this viewport meta as well. They're not necessary. They're either for older browsers or they're just kind of extraneous. Really, this will get you where you need to go for any viewport meta. And this is the same thing that's also in the course textbook if you want to read through that. All right, so we're going to go ahead and go ahead and add this meta. I'm just going to sort of put it inside my page at the top here. And with that in place, then when I view my page, right, even as I go from a mobile to a normal device, that even though I've said I'm on a phone, as my phone changes size, or if I'm going to view a different size phone, my web page stays the same zoom. It's just treating it as being a different width in a different browser. All right, so I'm going to go back to normal browser size views just to be able to make it, because it's a little bit easier for me to navigate through these pieces. All right, so let's talk about making Bootstrap responsive. So the idea here is that Bootstrap has, for most of Bootstrap's utility classes, it also includes responsive versions of those. Not for every utility class, but for most utility classes. So these classes are designated by including what basically a part, what's called an infix. So basically part of their class name, sort of in the middle, indicates at which size or larger that rule should apply. Bootstrap defines a number of different device sizes, right? Sort of like general categories of sizing. Sort of extra small is basically everything. Small is SM, medium, large, and extra large. These correlate roughly to small. Extra small is like anything small, like a very small phone. Small is like phone size, medium is tablet size, large is laptop size, extra large is desktop size, and extra large is big giant external monitor size kind of thing. That's roughly where these numbers, like these words correlate from. That's where this came from. It doesn't quite match up here because phones are pretty large and desktop and laptops can be pretty small. But that's kind of the general intention behind these sort of limits, these sizings. Note that in these cases, and there's pixel sizes as well, right? So small is anything that has a width of 576 pixels. Most phones, right? And extra large is anything more than 1200 pixels. The important part here is that these responsive utilities are really applied to any of this size or larger. So if we say that we want a rule to apply to small size devices, that rule will apply to anything that's small or bigger, right? So that rule will apply to small devices, medium, large, or extra large, right? It always goes all the way up the tree, or up the sort of the size hierarchy. The reason that is we're using it's following what's approach called mobile first design, where the idea is that we sort of say, here's our stylings for small devices, and big devices should have that same set of rules. They just might have tweaks as you go along the way. And we'll talk about this more when we get to the ideas of responsive design sort of in their own separate video. All right, so let's use an example. So we can take I'm using my previous Bootstrap example that we started in the previous Bootstrap video. And we can take, for example, our padding and our spacing rules here, and we can make these responsive. So currently we say that we want a padding of 2, and that's going to exist on all device sizes, right? So I've got this level 2 padding on the tops and bottoms, and no matter how big my device gets, right, it always has that amount of spacing around, like at the top and bottom. If I change this, I can say that I want it to be padding of 2 only on, let's go large size or larger. So again, now I don't have a rule. So let's go make sure our page is nice and small. So if I refresh it, now we're on a smaller device. This is actually, let's see, we are currently at about 7. So this is a small device because we're about 500 pixels wide. So actually, it's probably medium. That'll probably look fine. Right. So notice that because we're on a small device, this rule doesn't apply. This says only give it padding of 2 when we are medium or larger. If my page grows and I get to the point where I go above 768, which is medium, wait for it, ta-da! There's my level 2 padding is suddenly shown up. You see that? My level 2 padding. So we said that here's a rule that's going to apply at medium size or larger. So when I'm at small size, it doesn't apply. Medium size, it does apply. I can make this a little bit bigger to make it more sort of obvious what's happening, right? So small size, no padding. Medium size, padding. Large devices, right? Even when I get to larger, still has that padding, right? This is applying to, again, medium or bigger. And we, of course, can do that with any rule. We can do that with my padding bottom, my padding medium. You can't quite do it with colors, but you can do it with most any. There's lots of different classes that have these kinds of utilities here. The thing that often will happen then is I'll be able to specify multiple different device sizes and styling for different sizes by sort of adding a responsive utility at each individual size. So for example, I might say that maybe on small devices, on extra small devices, like by default, I want to have at least one thing of padding, right? Like that's enough padding on very small devices. But then I might say that so this says on all devices, have a padding level of 1. But we might say then on small devices, I want this to bump up to a padding level of 3. So now what we do is we say, great, on very small devices, extra small, we're padding level 1. When I get to a small device, now there's enough room that I can now jump to a padding level of 3. We might then say that on a large device, let's go up to 5. We'll say that a lot of padding when we get to large devices. Oh, don't save, sorry. Hit refresh. All right, so on small, little padding. or sorry, an extra small, little padding. When we get to small, we have 3 levels of padding. When we go to medium, we continue having 3 levels of padding. But when we get to large, we jump to having even more padding. So what we've done is we've added rules that says that at this size or larger, have this set of padding apply. And the way that Bootstrap rules are structured is that because even when you say or larger, if you then add an additional rule that says that bigger size or larger, right? Because this, for example, says this says everything, but this says now smaller, larger. This rule will override the small rule will override the sort of the extra small rule because that rule is now bigger, and how that comes together. Note that the order of these things doesn't matter, right? CSS rules are unordered. There actually isn't any, there's no point, there's no benefit or there's no impact from the order that you list the classes in your HTML. So even if I say go padding level 1, then padding larger is 5, then padding smaller is 3, we still get the same effect, right? At large, we have 5 levels of padding. At small or medium, we get 3 levels of padding, and at extra small, we get 1 level of padding. So the order doesn't matter from the browser's perspective. It matters from the human perspective for readability. We generally want things to be sort of increasing in size. I'll also note that it's totally okay to skip sizes, right? I said, here's my default, then here's what to do on small. I didn't say what to do on medium because I don't want medium to be different than my small. And then I said what to do on large. So you don't need to include every single rule, right? I don't need to say that on medium devices, continue being 3, right? This is redundant because this says on small or bigger, be 3. And this says on medium or bigger, also be 3, but medium is bigger than small. So I don't need to say continue being 3 when you get bigger because nothing has changed. So you only need to include rules when some effect is actually changed and modified along the way. All right, there we go. And that's the basic idea of adding these responsive utilities. And again, we have these for lots of different rules. They can all apply in the same way. If I go back, I took it off for a second, but if I go back and I give these things, if I want to make my cards into a flex box, right, that makes them be side by side, I could say, for example, that I only want that flex box to apply on medium sizes or larger. So, right, on a medium or larger device, turn into a flex box. So this will be on small devices. It won't lay out as a flex box, right? These are just going to be a block element. But then when I get to mediums, now that there's enough room, it shifts back into being this flex box. And of course, if I wanted to then say at large, go back to being block element, I can, of course, use my display properties to do that as well. And then it'll go back to being just, oh, hold on. No, you're always block. I guess you can't turn off the flex box when you get later. But we can basically be able to sort of change these effects as we go. No, maybe we did do. Hold on. There we go. Medium or larger. Okay, great. But yeah, so again, we can use these responsive utilities to have things change in size and styling as we get to different things. So I can design it so that on mobile devices, each card fills the page because that's enough room. But then when you get to larger devices, I can start having them move side by side by adding in some flexbox work to make that happen. I'll talk about a better way of doing that using the grid in just a moment. Okay, that's the basic idea of responsive utilities, right? We're going to specify utility. We're going to put the size generally in the middle to say how do I want to apply that rule at a particular size or larger. Okay. Cool. The next example as a particularly, so I don't think I'll slide this, right? No, I just got to the grid slides. The next example I want to sort of show is a very common utility class that's a responsive design class. What is called a container. So I'm going to give this a class container. Now, Bootstrap's use of the word container is the name that Bootstrap gives its class. You want to be really careful with this, though, because Bootstrap calls its class container. And so if you give an element a class container, that has a very particular Bootstrap meaning if you're using Bootstrap. But there's often a lot of other things we often want to call containers, like flex containers, we might call containers. There's lots of other ways you might use that name. So given that now that we're introducing Bootstrap, I would strongly recommend not using the class name container unless you really mean the Bootstrap one. All right, so here's a container. If I put my main inside of a container, you'll notice that here's my main section. You'll see that I get some margins along the side, right? So it now has some extra, like there's now some white space along the side there. If I get rid of my container, no space. If I add in my container, we gain some space. Now, here's the cool thing about containers. As my page gets bigger, you'll notice that my white space also gets bigger. If you look at this box here, right, my box says, hello, my name is Joel Ross, I'm Associate Teaching Professor. That box is staying the same even as my browser changes size, right? That box has a fixed width. So that column of content now is always the same width, even as my browser is changed in size. So as my browser gets bigger, right, I get more and more white space. I'm getting more and more white space as we go. Like, it's now getting to the point where, like, that's a lot of white space. It feels like maybe I could start making the central column bigger, right? Well, the container does that. As we get to the next breakpoint, right, we get to the next device size. So this is now we're moving from small, we're about to hit medium, which is at 768. When we get to medium, it says, oh my gosh, you're up to a medium device? Fine, let's make that fixed width, that column, that sort of space in the middle, let's make that bigger and have our white spaces go away. So that now it says, okay, let's jump down to having small amounts of margin. So we now have lots more room for actual content as well. Right now I can go to, hello, my name is Joel Ross, Associate Teaching Professor at the University of, before we have to word wrap. And again, this keeps happening. Now it stays that size and it continues to be that size until we get to the next device size, right? When we're jumping up to large, which is at 992. And when we get there, boop, it jumps up again. Now it's making it even wider and jumping back to having these small amounts of white space inside. So what the container does, it gives you sort of a fixed width central column where it's always going to be the same size, no matter sort of how, within some wiggle room of your browser size, right? So if your browser is 800 or 820 pixels wide, you're getting the same appearance, right? The same sort of length of column. You don't have to worry about like some words wrapping and some words not wrapping because your browser is slightly different size. But if you start having too much white space, it expands out. Or from the other perspective, if you have too little white space, right? So if I have some white space, but now I start shrinking my browser, getting to the point where I'm running out of white space, or it's starting to get cramped, it can jump down to having a smaller, thinner sort of section, fixed width column in the middle. And again, as that guy gets smaller, it jumps down again. As that guy gets smaller, it jumps down again. And from that point, then it actually just shrinks. At first, so once we get smaller devices, it just shrinks as we go. So containers are really useful for producing this kind of nice effect and basically having some nice kind of margins around your content. Note that I put my container around my main, not on my header. It's because I want my header to go the full size of the page. I want that big purple box. That said, if I want all of this content to still be inside of a container, a nice way of doing that is actually to add another div here. And I'm going to say I want all of that I want the header to fill the entire page, but I want the content to be inside of a div, to be inside of a container. So I can give this thing a class container. And now my content is inside of that sort of narrow box, even though my header now fills the whole page. And so now I get this pretty nice kind of effect where my page, my heading is more or less lining up with the body. There's some padding and sort of making you throw off a little bit. That's giving us the effect we want. Now, the thing to note here that I want to sort of point out is the, where'd it go? The container here, what it's doing is it's specifying a bunch of margins. It's basically specifying a width, a sizing, and a bunch of margin work. So what you never want to do is put one container inside of another, right? I would never want to say, let's make each of these cards also go inside of a container, because then those cards are also going to try to be like 700, 800 pixels wide with some margining along sides, and you won't get the effect you want. So generally what you'll do is you'll make either things like your main or your header or even the body itself into a container, and then that's it, right? We never put a container inside of another container. You'll find that most Bootstrap pages have a container. That's kind of a pretty standard way of structuring and designing what a Bootstrap web page is going to look like. Because again, it gives you a good sort of like, here's a basic central area that I can work with. It's not going to be tweaking its size too much. So it's always going to have, I'm not going to have to worry about like 10 pixels one way or 10 pixels another way, throwing off the size of my boxes, the size of my images, where my words wrap, etc. It's all going to be fairly standardized and clean, even if my browsers have very slight variation. Okay. That's why it's container. The other piece of responsive sort of ish classes I want to mention are called the grid. So Bootstrap provides a set of grids that is basically Bootstrap's way of doing flexboxing. So as I said, Bootstrap does let us write our own flexbox. We can use the dflex class in order to be able to sort of turn things into flexboxes. But Bootstrap also provides another way of defining something that's very flexbox-like, and it's actually built with flexbox sort of underneath the hood. That's the rule. That's the properties being applied in the CSS file. But it lets you design your page without having to think about the flexbox. You can just think about the content itself. And it does this by using what are called grids. So the idea in Bootstrap with grids, if I want to create a kind of grid based of content, right? What I can do is I can define a row of content, which you can think of as like a flexbox. And inside that row, I'll have multiple rows, I can then put columns of content. And we're going to write classes like that to do exactly that work. So what I can then do, for example, instead of making this thing be, where's my card box? Where's my card box? So instead of making this thing a flexbox, so I'm going to get rid of my deflex thing here going on. All right. So now I don't have a flexbox. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to make sure that I say I want my course cards here to be a single row, a row of content. And when I do that, it by default doesn't change anything. But what you will notice if you look at our developer tools is that it has turned my oh, sorry, it's this one. Nope, never mind. It isn't that one. It is this one. It's turned my course row into a flexbox, right? This row class is giving it a display flex with the flex wrap property, right? We're acting it like a flexbox. Once we've defined that we want an element to be inside of a row, and note that a row has to go inside of a container somewhere. So you sort of want to be, so that's why generally we put everything in a container and then you can contain grids inside of it. Once I've defined a row, I can go ahead and define the columns. Now, the way that we define columns in Bootstrap is we indicate how many columns out of 12 we want each individual item to take up. So a Bootstrap grid has, think of it as having like 12 columns, like 12 cells across in a spreadsheet, like Excel or Google Sheets or numbers, something like that, right? You've had your cells, there are 12 boxes along the top. What we can then do is we can basically specify how many of those slots we want each element to take up. Out of those 12, how many should it take? This is similar to how, like, if you're working in Excel, how you might think about merging cells. That's more or less what we're doing. It's similar to actually the column span thing when we talked about from tables way back when. So what I can do, for example, is I can say I want this first card to take up 3 cells out of my 12 for my column, so that my grid. So that's going to take up 1/4 of the page because it's 3 out of 12. I can have my next card take up 6 of those columns. That's going to take up half my page. And then I'm going to have my next card take up another 3. And then I'm going to have my next one. Notice I've gone through 12, which means my next one's going to wrap around to the next line because we've got that LIS wrap property in place. I'm going to have my next one take up 4 spaces. And then I'll have this one take up 4 spaces as well out of my 12, which would then take 4. So the first one's going to take up 3, and then 6, and then 3. And then we're out of 12, so we'll wrap around the next line. And then we're going to take up 4 and 4 and leave the last third of the page empty. And when we refresh our page, see, that's the effect that I get. I have this one's taking up 1/4 of my column. This one's taking up half of it. This one's taking up 1/4 of it. You notice this thing is about twice as long as this thing. And then these guys are taking up each 1/3. So what we're able to do is we're able now to define how much space I want this to take up, right? How much of these things I want my flex boxes to take up, right? What do I want their grow properties to be? Instead of specifying it using a flex box, we can specify it using a grid. Even though it's built with Flexbox underneath the hood, that's what's actually making it work the way we want. The grid lets us define these things in sort of better sizing ways that sort of make more sense. So I can give it sort of that kind of sizing, right? If I decide I want them to all be equal, right? I want it to be 4, 4, and 4. I can do that. Make you 4, 4, and 4. Now everything is 4 things wide, which means I now get a nice kind of gridding kind of effect. If I want these to be everything to be half the page, I can make it all 6, 6, 6. all the way down. And yes, it's a little redundant because you have to keep typing the same thing over and over again. And now they're all taking up half the page to make that work. Great. And that's the basics of how we work our grid. Now, the really cool thing about the grid, though, is that it supports responsive infixes, right? We can make responsive versions of this grid. So I could say, for example, on a small device, I don't want them taking up these two things side by side. That feels a little bit cramped. So I might say that I want these things to take up 12 spaces by default, right? On small devices, they should always take up 12 spaces. So they're going to take up the whole row, right? All the way across the page on sort of my very small devices. Then when I get to small devices, and I get to be about this big, now I might say, you know what? Now I have enough room to put these two things side by side. So I might say that then on small devices, I should have them move to being 6 things wide. Call SM6. Call SM6. You know what? Let's leave this one to be column 12. Let's have the middle, so there's like 2 next to each other, and then a big one, and then 2 next to each other. Just, to help add a bit of variety to it. And so I can show you how this works. But that on a small device, right? My first 2 cards take up 6 grids, right? 6 out of 12. They take up 1/2 the page themselves. This one takes up the whole thing, and these ones take up then these 4. As my page gets bigger, right? If I jump to getting the point where I'm now on medium things, I might say, okay, that still looks okay on medium. That's fine. But when I get to large, now these things look really stretchy. That doesn't feel quite right. So we could then say that on large devices, let's have them jump down to being 4. We'll have them be 3 across. So I'll have 3 of them next to each other. So each one will take up a third, right? 4 of those 12 spaces. You can also go to call large 4. You can go to call large 4. And you can go to call large 4. So in our large device, we then get back to being sort of our nice kinds of gridding kind of effect. Again, this is a way we can use responsive design stuff to be able to make it so that our layout is customized based on what size device we're on, right? So on really small devices, like your cell phone, for example, your small cell phone, it's going to just lay them out top to bottom, so you have to scroll a bit, you can flick with your finger, but you don't have to worry about starting seeing things side by side. When you get to tablets and small laptops, right, then we're going to sort of get to this putting some things side by side, but we still have this kind of nice box in the middle. But then if you get to a really big screen, like a desktop or a big laptop, then you'll be able to sort of see okay, I want to have put these things side by side and be able to have them look this particular way. Again, note that I'm skipping levels, right? I did not have to say call medium, right? I don't have to say stay 6 at size medium, right? I can just say that because this is small or larger, it's going to continue to apply to mediums as well. And again, the order of these things doesn't actually matter, but I'm putting them in sort of a sort of ascending size order to keep everything clear. So again, the basic idea with responsive stuff is you specify what do you want to look like on very small, sort of initial size, phone size devices, and then how do you want it to change? What about it do you want to change at all as you get to bigger devices? And Bootstrap then lets you write rules to do that kind of work. Cool. So that's the basic idea with responsive utility. So what this lets you do is, again, it lets you specify different paddings and sizing and gridding work and different kinds of effects based on where the size of the browser that you're working on, or based on how wide that device happens to be. Most responsive utilities have some kind of responsive aspect to them. Getting some particular kinds of effects as these things get large involve having some utilities and some utilities on and off. Again, there's a good place to go look for examples. Look through the documentation for how you might be able to adjust things, sort of how you might use these responsive utilities to create the page you want sort of in a particular way. And we'll talk about more what we mean by responsive work and actually how Bootstrap makes it do this kind of changing appearance based on the size of the device. We'll talk about how to do that more in a future video. Okay, great. Thank you.